Catherine the Great, the ruler of Russia, had turned down King George's demand that she supply the British with mercenaries. That's what led King George to turn to the Hessian troops. And then Catherine the Great had formed what she called the League of Armed Neutrality, neutral nations that would break the British blockade during the American Revolution, getting past the British Navy to resupply the Americans. That too indicated support for the American cause, so much so that Washington called Catherine the Great the mother of American independence. And after our revolution was over, we continued to have cordial ties with Russia. We developed very quickly a trading relationship with them. Jefferson and the Tsar of Russia corresponded, and the American president and the American Tsar were close all the way through the Civil War. Lincoln communicated with the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, the man who liberated the serfs of Russia. And so there was always a closeness between the two countries. And this arrival, the surprise arrival of the Russian Baltic Fleet in New York and the Russian Far Eastern Fleet in San Francisco, was seen by Americans and by the world as a message from Russia. If any European country tries to interfere in American affairs, they not only will fight the United States, they will fight America's friend, the Russian Navy. So this factor seems to have been another reason why intervention from Europe didn't occur. The Russians planted their fleet in a position to help defend, so it would appear, the North from the British or French incursions. Certainly the North thought so. There were celebrations in all of the northern cities, celebrations in San Francisco. The Russian sailors were treated to night after night of party in San Francisco and in New York, as grateful populations thanked them for their presence. There was never a single indication, though, from the Russian fleet that they would fight if called upon to do so. They never confirmed nor denied that they were here to prevent intervention, but everybody assumed that to be the case. And only one instant did they actually come close to using weapons. There'd been a fire in San Francisco, and the Russian soldiers, the Russian sailors on board the Russian Far Eastern Fleet had volunteered to help the San Francisco Fire Department put out this massive blaze. In appreciation, the people of San Francisco threw a big street party. Everybody drank too much and too late into the night, and the next morning there was a rumor that two Confederate ships were going to sail into San Francisco harbor and bombard the city. The Russian admiral sent his soldiers, his sailors, back to their ships and sailed out to meet them. They never arrived. That's the closest the Russians came to actually firing a shot on behalf of the North. But their very presence here was a morale boost and a message that the world heard. Several factors explain this extraordinary arrival of this surprise ally. Earlier in our history, until maybe 1915, we liked the Russians. And during that period, we told ourselves that the Russian fleet had come here to prevent foreign intervention. We listened and heard the argument that the Russian fleet had come because, indeed, they cared about us. But around the 1890s, we began to hear stories of atrocities coming from Russia, of the pogroms, which were official acts of violence against Jewish people. And large numbers of Jewish immigrants began to come to America from Eastern Europe and from Russia. And they told tales which made the American people wonder whether we really had any commonality of interest with Russia at all. And public opinion began to shift against Russia in the 1890s. By the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, which brought the communists to power in Russia and turned Russia from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union, Americans had turned against their former friend. And the histories written after about 1917 discount the idea that the Russian fleet came here to defend the Union. They now said, and now say, that the Russian fleet came here for Russian self-interest. You may recall that the Russians had fought a war with the British and the French in the Crimea in the 1850s. The Russians feared another war with England and France. And they didn't want to have their fleet bottled up in the Baltic. are isolated from warm water ports in the Pacific. And so, since the Americans were the enemies of the British and the French, and the Russians were enemies of the British and the French, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the Russian fleet came here because our ports were safer than their ports. And they knew that we would protect their fleet, and that it would be a mutual protection situation. So historians now argue that it was simply Russian self-interest that brought the fleet here. They were not so much coming here to defend America as they were coming here to save themselves. There's also a third explanation for why the fleet arrived, and this one has sort of run through both time periods. The time period when we said it was because they were our friends, and the time period when we said it was because they were selfish. And this one has again to do with this factor of choosing exactly the right diplomat. Lincoln chose as the ambassador to Russia a man who probably is the most unique ambassador in American history, certainly the most unique I've read about. A fascinating man, a man whose behavior was far from diplomatic, a man whose name you probably have heard, though you've heard it in reference to someone else. This man was named Casious Marcellus Clay. You recognize the name largely because it's a name that Muhammad Ali was born with. And Muhammad Ali's father was also called Casious Marcellus Clay. Both Casious Clay or Muhammad Ali and his father were named for this man, a white man who lived in the period before the Civil War in Kentucky. Clay was born in Kentucky in 1810 in Madison County, eastern Kentucky. He was sent off to the east to go to school, graduated from a northern university, came back at the age of 21 to Kentucky and inherited Whitehall Plantation. Clay's first act as a plantation owner and as a slave owner was to do something that horrified the entire South. He set free all 100 of the slaves' plantations. This was a substantial investment and a substantial financial loss. To think of 100 slaves, which was the way that Southerners measured property. This was a very large plantation. Clay was an abolitionist. This was unusual for an abolitionist to exist, certainly as a slave owner. It was unusual for abolitionists to exist in the South, period. Even those Southerners who were opposed to slavery seldom were as extreme as being abolitionists. They might have thought mildly that slavery was wrong, but they didn't do anything about it.